The movie starts with a guy named Joe, who is sitting with a woman whose son he kidnapped. The woman pleads with him to reveal his whereabouts. Joe contacts his teammate, Marvin, and instructs him to release the kid. He cautions the woman not to disclose their encounter and directs her to the playground where her son is. The woman rushes out and finds her son there. The next day, a family heads to their aircraft port by sea. Will, the father, talks to his wife, Karen, about this being his last conference. He assures his family that he has booked a cabin for them to spend time together when he returns. Will playfully waggles the craft's wings to delight his daughter, Abby. Karen and Abby head home. Abby helps her mom with the laundry and is suddenly kidnapped by Marvin and Joe. Karen, realizing Abby isn't responding, confronts Joe, who informs her that Abby isn't there and asks her to remain calm. Unable to find Abby in the house, Karen rushes upstairs to retrieve Will's gun. Meanwhile, Will arrives in Seattle for the conference where he is speaking that night. At the house, Karen holds Joe at gunpoint. Joe reveals that Abby is with his cousin Marvin, and he'll kill Abby if Marvin doesn't receive a call every 30 minutes. Joe explains it's a kidnapping for ransom, the 5th time they've done it, and assures Karen that Abby will be fine if she follows the rules. He emphasizes that shooting him would be the same as shooting Abby, destabilizing Karen and allowing him to take the gun. Karen suggests emptying their account to give him the money, but Joe rejects it, explaining that no ransom is safe from the FBI. At the conference, Will discusses his new anesthetic agent that allows doctors to use paralyzing relaxants without fear of fatal outcomes or lawsuits. Back at the house, Joe tells Abby the ordeal will last 24 hours. Karen, fearing for Abby, mentions her asthma, and Joe, initially unconvinced, discovers asthma medicine in the drawer. Joe calls Marvin, and Karen tries to resist him, but he subdues her. Karen advises Marvin to give Abby strong coffee during breathing troubles. Meanwhile, after Will's conference, a woman named Cheryl, who has been eyeing Joe, rushes to the elevator with him. During this time, Joe tells Karen she needs to do something for him out of gratitude for helping Abby. He asks to see the bedroom, and she complies. At the lodge, Cheryl follows Will to his door, attempting to seduce him. Will resists, but Cheryl reveals Abby's kidnapping and threatens him not to involve the police. She outlines the ransom plan, involving Karen wiring $250,000 and faking a need for new art in his collection. Meanwhile, Abby wakes up scared. Marvin calms her and gives her a doll, urging her to be good. Later, Cheryl tells Joe that entering Will's house was challenging, as he doesn't fall for it like other men. It seems part of the plan is to get romantically involved with both parents. Joe, sitting on Karen to restrain her, lets Will talk to her. Cheryl informs Joe about Abby's asthma, and Joe instructs her to focus on the job. When asked, Cheryl claims Joe is her husband. At the hideout, Marvin decides to meet Joe with Abby, but a dusty blanket triggers an asthma attack. After all attempts to calm her down fail, he rushes into the kitchen to make some coffee, and it takes a while for her to stabilize. Joe and Karen drive to meet Marvin and Abby. Joe instructs Karen to give Abby her medicine and tough it out, or he'll shoot both of them. When they meet, Karen hugs Abby. Karen administers medicine, and Marvin informs Joe about Abby's scare, prompting memories of another little girl, Katie. Joe assures Marvin that this won't be the same. Karen advises Abby to obey Marvin and not let him follow her into the bathroom. Eventually, Marvin takes Abby back, and Karen, unable to restrain herself, rushes toward them. Joe drags her away, reminding her of the dangerous world little Abby's live in. He calls Cheryl, confirming Abby received her medicine. Will, devastated, hits Cheryl with the phone. A fight ensues, but he stops when he sees scars that reveal Joe has been beating her. He takes her gun and questions her commitment to the kidnapping, suspecting it's more Joe's idea. Cheryl refuses to betray her husband and asks for the gun back so she doesn't have to tell Joe when he calls. Meanwhile, Abby tells Marvin about her cat that went to heaven. Marvin shares a story about his family member, Katie, who is also in heaven. Joe calls Cheryl and learns Will hit her. Joe hits Karen with the phone, making Will hear her scream, claiming he'll treat Karen the same. Back home, Joe talks to Karen and prepares dinner. He apologizes for hitting her, cleans her up, and, while sniffing her hair, they hear a knock on their glass door, which turns out to be a lady named Joan, their neighbor, who sees them. When Joan arrives, Joan asks her how she knows Will, but he tells her that he met him at the Northside Hospital. When Joan mentions that Will hasn't worked at the Northside Hospital for a year, Joe tells them that's where he met him. Joe coerces Karen to confirm he's her romantic partner due to relationship issues. After clarifying things, Joan soon leaves. At Will's hotel, he tells her he saw her C-section scar and begs her to stop this if she has children of her own. At home, after dinner, Karen rushes to the computer when Joe steps away for a short time to send a message to Will to let him know that somehow Joe knows that he worked at Northside. When the message doesn't go through, she rushes back to meet Joe. She asks him how they pick the families they go after, so he tells her they have to be rich, have kids the right age, and the moms have to be pretty. She asks him how he knows about Northside General and how he knows Will, but Joe only walks away. When she follows him, he leads her to Abby's room and tells her that the fact that the room is empty is why they won't have any trouble playing house that night. Meanwhile, at the hotel, Will removes all the bullets from Cheryl's gun while she's asleep. In the house, Joe starts to get intimate with Karen, and she lets him come close. As he tries to undress her, she asks him to allow her to do it herself in the bathroom, and he allows her. When she goes into the bathroom, She scurries around to find something she can use to defend herself. At the cabin, Abby tells Marvin that she's hungry, so he goes to microwave some popcorn. Abby grabs her medicine from the bag while he's not looking and tells him she's going to the bathroom, but she watches him from the door, which she cracks open. At the house, Karen dresses in lingerie but slips a scalpel in her underwear. When she steps out, she runs into Joe, who offers her some wine. They soon get the action going on, and she goes on top of him and tells him she'd like to take charge. He lets her, so she pulls down his shorts and holds his manhood, wielding a scalpel towards it. When he finds out, he calls her bluff, but she tells him to call Marvin and tells him to bring Abby here to get the money or she'll castrate him. At the cabin, Abby grabs Marvin's phone and runs out the door while Marvin is still in the kitchen. He suddenly hears his phone ring, so he looks around for it and realizes Abby is missing. He looks around for Abby and runs outside to look for her. Meanwhile, Joe tells Karen that Marvin isn't picking up, so she becomes scared that something has happened to Abby. Her panic gives Joe enough time to kick her away, but she slices a part of his leg before she lets go. Karen runs into the bathroom with the phone and calls again, but this time, Abby picks up and tells her she's in the woods. Karen tells her to run further away and place a call to the police. While they're talking, Marvin finds Abby and takes the phone from her. Joe bangs on the bathroom door and tells her to open up. When he breaks in, Karen points the gun at him and tells him to order Marvin not to hurt Abby. Joe simply tells Marvin to call Abby if he hears a shot, so Karen gives him the gun. At the hotel, Will receives a message from Karen, telling him that Joe knows he worked at Northside, which means this is a personal vendetta, and they'll kill Abby regardless. He immediately gets his paralytic sedative and confronts Cheryl about the message. He asks her where Abby is, so she tells him she doesn't know. When he shows her the sedative, which will paralyze her, she holds him at gunpoint and tells him she can kill him. He tells her to pull the trigger, so he injects her when she hesitates. The sedative paralyzes her, so he tells her limp body that she's going to die if he leaves her without the ability to breathe. He tells her he's going to keep doing this over and over until she talks, or he can't resuscitate her again. He gives her the antidote, and she starts to cough as she comes back. Cheryl suddenly starts to cry when she thinks about how her baby must have felt when she was under a sedative. Will is confused, so she tells him to check the picture in her wallet, which turns out to be a picture of Katie, a patient whom he sedated 2 years ago. He tells her that he didn't kill Katie, but the surgeon who operated on her tumor cut major arteries and had just blamed him to cover up for his mistake. This surprises Cheryl, so Will begs her to reveal Abby's location. Meanwhile, Karen cleans up Joe's wounds. She reminds him it's time to make the call, so he tells her she thinks she's smarter than the other moms, but their children are still alive because they didn't hurt him. He tells her to think about how unnerved Marvin will be as the clocks have started ticking since he hasn't made the regular 30-minute call. Karen begs him to help her because Abby is her little baby. In the cabin, Marvin glumly realizes the time has passed and looks at his phone. Sadly, he tells Abby to play a game where she closes her eyes and thinks happy thoughts. He wraps his hands around her neck to strangle her when the call suddenly comes in. He chastises Joe about being late. Karen is relieved and tells Joe she will get out of his way, and he'll get his money. He asks her if she ever thought maybe he's motivated by something other than money. That night, Will calls a friend of his, who is the vice president of a cell phone company, to help him trace some calls he has been receiving on his phone. He tells him about his daughter's kidnapping and begs him not to call the police. The next morning, Will receives a call from his friend about a cell phone logging onto a tower every 30 minutes and is given a general location. He says he can put a tracking car in the area, but he needs to involve someone higher up than him. When Cheryl overhears the call, she drags the phone from him and tells him he can't put Joe's life in danger. Meanwhile, Karen and Joe go to the bank to see Will's broker to get the money wired to him in cash in Seattle. When they drive away from the bank, Joe notices a chopper following them, so he orders Karen to drive into a lot. He finds a random woman by her car, so he forces her into her trunk and steals the car. The chopper stops following them, so Joe realizes he was right after all. In Seattle, Joe goes to pick up the cash, but he is called away to see some FBI agents. They tell him they received a tip that his daughter has been kidnapped, and they tell him they need him to wear a wire. He protests that they'll kill his daughter, so they tell him they know what they're doing and ask him to wear a wire. He soon gets back in the car with Cheryl, who inspects the cash. Joe soon calls Cheryl to confirm if she got the money, and he asks her if there's anything he wants to tell her. She wants to tell him what she learned about Katie, but she doesn't because he won't believe her. He tells her to take a flight out of Seattle, but she tells him he's breaking the rules because that will get them in trouble. He tells her he makes the rules and tells her to do what she's told. She tells him it's not right to hurt people, but he tells her he's not going to hurt anyone, but he's going to get her a surprise. Will tells her that she has to tell him that she didn't kill Katie. Cheryl calls Marvin to tell him that Joe is breaking the rules and he will hurt Abby, but Marvin hangs up the call because it's against the rules to call him. When Will realizes that Cheryl is on his side, he throws the wire out of the car and tells Cheryl he has an idea. He calls his cell company to forward his calls so that everyone who calls him thinks he's still in Seattle. He goes to his port, and they both fly out of Seattle towards the cabin that his friend told him they're holding Abby in. During the flight, Joe calls Will, so Will kills the plane engine so Joe doesn't overhear it. The plane goes towards the water, but luckily the call is a quick one, so he quickly turns on the engine. Meanwhile, Marvin hands Abby a wooden beaver he made for her. On the plane, the phone starts to ring, so Cheryl picks up the call. Joe is surprised that Cheryl picked up the call since she should have left Seattle, and he wanted to talk to the doctor. Cheryl lies and says that she's just leaving Will's hotel, so Joe tells her to give Will the phone. So he tells him that he will never see Abby again. Will starts to panic and doesn't kickstart the plane's engine again, but Cheryl's scream brings his attention back. When he does, he receives a message from Karen, who tells him she and Will are on the highway behind Marvin and Abby. Will tries to contact the FBI to set their helicopter on the road, but they tell him they're too far away. Will loses patience and advances towards the road himself to track down the truck. Will flies over Joe's car, and Joe eventually realizes he's the one. When Cheryl points out Marvin's truck, Joe suddenly calls Marvin to point out the plane. Karen suddenly jumps to grab the phone from Joe, and she turns the steering wheel until they swerve off the road and their car overturns. Will lands right in front of Marvin's car, causing him to swerve off the road. Several trucks coming from behind try to avoid the plane, but they're unable to. But Will and Cheryl jump out right in time before they're pummeled to bits. Abby runs out of the car towards the plane and starts to cry when she believes Will is dead. Meanwhile, Will runs towards Marvin's car and points a gun to his head, demanding where Abby is. Suddenly, Joe appears and shoots Will in the leg. Joe tells Will he'll spend the rest of his life feeling like he did. Will tries to tell him he didn't kill Katie, but Joe doesn't listen. Joe scurries around and calls out Abby's name. He eventually finds Cheryl crouched with Abby. He tells Cheryl that Abby is the surprise he has for her, and she'll become a part of their family. Cheryl refuses, and they start an argument in the middle of the road. Joe drags Cheryl into the car, with Marvin in the backseat. Suddenly, Abby has another asthma attack, so Marvin runs out to get the medicine from the car. Joe runs after him, but Karen suddenly hits him with the butt of her gun from behind. She points the gun at Marvin and tells him to put Abby down so she can give her the medicine. On the ground, Joe tries to aim at Karen, but Will suddenly jumps on him and struggles to get the gun from him. Karen tries to aim a shot at Joe but can't get a perfect shot. She hesitates for a bit, but eventually leaves 2 bullets in Joe's chest. When Joe falls to his death, both parents rush to Abby's side to give her her medicine. The police soon arrive on the scene and make several arrests. What an action-packed thriller. I really enjoyed this one, and I felt sadness for Joe's loss of his daughter. But it wasn't right to do what he did seeking revenge, especially against the wrong people. What did you guys think of this one?
Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps the channel.